Welcome, my friends, to Moments with the Master. My name is Albert Dixon, and I'm the preacher at the Mill Road Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And beside me is my good friend John Henry, who's the preacher at St. Leon's in St. Leon's, Indiana. And we're the host of this program, and our endeavor is to glorify God in the things that we say and do. And we encourage you and invite you to study along with us as we spend the few moments with the Master. If you have any questions or comments, at the end of the program, you'll be provided information where you can contact us, and we would hope to hear from you. Even visit with us, as that information will be made available. And you also have the opportunity to subscribe to the program, which will notify you that the program is about ready to begin. If you have any friends or family that might be interested in a program like this, we encourage you to let them know about us so that they too can join us at 7 p.m. on Thursday evenings and spend a few moments with the Master, studying His Word, growing in the grace and knowledge of His will. We have been studying about the plan that God put into place to redeem man. And we're in Genesis chapter 45, and we'll get there in just a few moments. But just to do just a brief recap of what we have covered thus far, John, in our discussion, we have gotten to where Joseph is now in Egypt. He's second command there. They're in the midst of a famine, and this relates to the dream that Pharaoh had, and Joseph interpreted the dream that they had the years of plenty, but now they're in the years of the famine. And Joseph's brothers have come down because they were the ones that sold him into slavery.
Yeah.
And they didn't know that this is Joseph that they are encountering. And so we're in the last throes of this, where Joseph has set them up, and they have been brought back to Joseph's location. And they think that they're in trouble because Joseph had it set up to where they were accused and brought back. And what we see in this, or have learned thus far, we see the maturity of the brothers, and even Judah stepping up and considering to be a surety for the things that have gone on, and he's going to take responsibility. Joseph sees this, which brings us into chapter 45, and he just could not contain himself. And he just breaks down and cries. And then, as we saw in the earlier part of the chapter, he tells his brothers to come near, and he reveals himself to them. And it's such a touching moment, John, as he has been down there about a couple of decades now, and they haven't seen him. And here he is revealing himself to them. And one of the things he had to do was encourage them not to grieve or be angry with themselves. And so it's a touching picture. And then Joseph begins to explain the providence of God, which is a great picture.
Yeah. I was looking over this while you was talking there. And one of the things in verse 3, I know the King James, I've got both here, King James, New King James. But in the King James, it uses, there at the very end, it says, "For they were troubled at his presence." And so my understanding of that is that they were displayed such a shock. It was so traumatic that, they were left speechless.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine anybody in that situation would have been the same thing. It just kind of like one of those moments where, wow, just kind of took my breath away. They didn't know what to say.
Absolutely.
But then again, like you said, he tells them to come on down here, and he said, "I'm Joseph. I'm your brother. You sold me into slavery." And but he says, he explains to them, this is God's providence here at work.
Right.
So don't be angry with yourselves. God said, or Joseph said, God, through God's providence, he put me down here to save our prosperity and, our lives. And it goes back to the promise that he made with Abraham once again, to make out of his seed a great nation. And this is the promise that's going to be fulfilled here that we need to keep our eyes on, because they're going to go down into Egypt, and we're going to see that here in just a moment. Them going down into Egypt. They're going to be given the land of Goshen, of course, a beautiful piece of land in Egypt. I believe it referred to as the nicest piece of land. And they're separated from the Egyptians, and then they're able to prosper and grow after about 300 years or so into this great and mighty nation, and that's when God, calls Moses. But anyhow, just kind of jumping ahead a little bit so we can kind of keep our eye on that. I think that's important that we realize, what's going on. And, another thing probably that comes into all this is I'm sure the brothers remember when Joseph was a young man, and remember them dreams, right. And the brothers got upset, and mother and father was kind of upset, and just thought, well, he trying to fool us or something, I guess.
Right.
But anyway, as we go on down through here, then, and in verse 7 he said, "And God set me before you to preserve a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he had made me a father to Pharaoh and the Lord all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Haste ye and go up to my father and say to him, Thus saith thy son Joseph, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not." One of the things, another thing that I see here, it's in verse 7, of course, mentioned that God sent me before you to preserve this lineage. And then the next thing, notice in verse 8, Albert, he said, "So now it was not you that sent me hither." They're the ones that sold him, but he turns that around and said, "Oh, that really wasn't you that did it." Look what he said. He said, God, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh. And so, they're probably thinking in their mind, once they find out, wow. They couldn't imagine that in what we would say 1,000,000 years, that he would get down there, become second in command over all Egypt, and then he exposes himself and says, "I'm your brother Joseph, take it easy." This was God's plan. God brought me down here, So, now I don't know, I can't speak for them boys, but it should have lifted a little bit of that burden, I would think, off their chest that they probably would have had. And so, here's adversity that was being used, but it was being used in God's way.
That's right.
And when, God's way never fails.
Absolutely. That's right.
So,
and that says a lot about, again, Joseph's maturity, and it also lends itself to a practical aspect for us, that some of the situations we find ourselves in, if we're followers of God, we're going to see that God puts us in situations so that we might be able to glorify Him, that we would glorify Him. But a lot of times we forget, because we're either angry with God or we fall into the self-pity, instead of acknowledging that God is still there, that God does care, and why has He put me here? And then begin to search out those answers. And then sometimes is where somebody might need a word of encouragement. Someone might be able to see that, hey, God does care and need this kind of strength to help them through life. And so those things are there and are reminders that even though this is in the situation of God's ultimate plan developing, but these are some practical lessons that we learn, that God is still active in our world. He sure is. He cares. He knows what's going on. And there are situations, again, that we find ourselves in as servants of Christ, servants of God, and that we need to be aware that perhaps is there to glorify Him and seek and take advantage of those opportunities. But when we start complaining, woe is me, we forget that. And we forget that we serve an awesome and powerful God who knows what He's doing.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
when we keep that in mind, I think we'll find ourselves having the kind of attitude that Joseph has about the whole situation, from being a slave in Potiphar's house to being falsely accused and then put into prison, and then from the prison cells to next to this ruler in all of Egypt to preserve life. And but if we have that woe is me attitude and that self-pity, we forget about God. And that should not be our mindset. Our mindset is always keep God first.
Yeah, and just to add to what you said about adversity, sometimes in life things might happen and we totally don't understand.
Right.
But like you said, sometimes we want to complain about it. Well, after time goes on and we kind of look back sometimes,
yes,
we think to ourselves, maybe, was this the providence of God at work?
Right.
And was He working through me and this was the result?
Right.
But like you said, sometimes we seem to lose our patience with God, I think,
Right.
And we just can't do that. So
so it becomes a very valuable lesson. And what else too about Joseph's attitude that we further see in this chapter is that he was so impressive to Pharaoh that when word comes to him that Joseph's family is there and that he's pleased with that. It shows his reaction there in verse 16 as we continue to drop down, as we looked at the reunion of the brothers and the weeping that goes on and these things in their true perspective. And then you get down to verse 16, it says, now when the news was heard in Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. So that's an impressive impact that Joseph has had on Pharaoh as he's serving and glorifying God, and then you have these things that take place. And so, this also could, again, lend itself to helping Pharaoh recognize the true and living God, because
sure.
Remember, they had their gods as well, but none like the God that Joseph was serving. So that is a tremendous impact.
I think you're going to see this because in this next verse 17, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, saying to thy brethren, this do ye, lade your beast and go, get you unto the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households, and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land in Egypt, and ye shall cat the fat of the land. So anyway, this is one time that's interesting to me that Pharaoh shows his authority over Joseph, and he says, now you go get your family.
Right.
Like you said a moment ago, he heard about it, but then he calls for you go get your family and bring them up here. Right. And so you can tell from that to me, Pharaoh was really impressed. Of course, as we go on down through there, once they all get there, the next thing that's going to happen is Joseph is going to explain to them basically what they need to say to get the land of Goshen. Right. And what they need to tell Pharaoh once Pharaoh calls them in before him. And let's see. And then, the other thing about this is when his brothers get back there to the land of Canaan, the next thing they got to do is bring the news to their father Jacob about all this, because see, they lied.
Right.
And now he's alive, and you begin to wonder, you know, that could give him cardiac arrest or something, you know,
Right.
to all of a sudden, okay, well, man, I thought he was dead. Oh, now he's alive.
Right.
And, you know, he probably realized, you know, what happened when they told him all this. And it says, let's see here. And he told, verse 26, and he told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. Now, it carries the idea here that he literally fainted. I don't know if it gives that, let's see.
Yeah, yes, it's sort of like the, in verse 27, when they told him all the words that he had spoken to them, when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So there's an indication he was so stunned, as the New American Standard points out there in verse 26, and he didn't believe them. But when he saw the things that were sent, wow.
There's been so much deception, I think.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely.
I'm sure
Absolutely.
that as a father, you know, he had some intuition about, you know, what all had been transpiring, and he probably had some thoughts over the years, and then all this happens, and you know, he hears that his son's still alive, and unless there's evidence, you know, why should he? Because, you know, he didn't want to send Benjamin down there because he didn't trust the boys.
Right.
Because they was afraid they're going to let something happen to him.
Right.
So, you know, but now he sees the evidence, and even though he's stunned, he like you said, he kind of revives because of all this.
Yeah. And then he turns around, and it's interesting. He just points out, it is enough. He says, my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. And so you see this eagerness to see Joseph. And John, that brings us into chapter 46. And in chapter 46, as you continue to read through this unfolding of God's plan and in these situations, that God himself, Jacob offers a sacrifice to God, the God of his father Isaac. And then verse 2 tells us that God speaks to Jacob in a vision, or in visions here, and encouraging Jacob to go with them and not to be afraid. And this is where you see God is a God of history and a God who keeps promises. Because here he reminds Jacob that he is the God of his father. And he says, you go down to Egypt, and he says, I will make you a great nation there. And that reflects all the way back to chapter 17, the promise that God made to Abraham. And here this is restated to Jacob to remind him of the promise that God had made to his fathers. And so you go. And he says, because what will happen is I'm going to bring you up again from Egypt. And so again, God of history, a God who keeps promises and remembers them, showing the faithfulness of God, that we can trust him. And when you look back at the lives of the brothers, yeah, there was a lot of deception going on. And that's the way we are sometimes. We strive to do what's right, but we just fail. But not with God. God is always faithful. So this is a lesson to help us to see that God makes promises, he keeps them. And so when we're learning more and more about him, the things that he reveals to us on how we are to be, we need to trust that God is going to deliver. He delivers on the promises of goodness, and he will deliver on the statements of punishment if we're not faithful to it.
Right.
So we need to accept God at his word. And that's a reminder of us in these things as we look at these situations.
Well, then, you know, like you said, after he has this worship service, where he offers these sacrifices and God talks to him. Then the next part, as we go down through here, Jacob begins traveling again towards Egypt. And it says here, the little ones, their wives, and the wagons, and which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. They took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, and Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with them, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him unto Egypt. And I think that's important, because when it goes back to that seed promise that Abraham made, one of the things that God was trying to do was to keep the seed of Abraham pure. And of course, we begin to see that already with just the 12 boys when they was looking for wives and things. And so here the Bible says, they finally arrived down there in Egypt. And of course, Pharaoh is going to grant them the land of Goshen. And then it picks up again, of course, in verse 26.
And what I was going to say along with that, they go out and they end up in Egypt. It's sort of like a handful, but later on we're going to see it's going to be a large number that come out of Egypt. And again, God pointing out his promises that he is made, and he's fulfilling that. And we need to be patient with God, because God is going to operate on his timetable, not ours, his. So we just trust him that they will be fulfilled. And remember, when God made the promise to Abraham, Abraham didn't see this taking place. Even though God told him about it, he believed God, but Abraham didn't live to see these things unfold.
Right.
We have them recorded for us that we could see, again, God in action, and God fulfilling those promises, and as we follow this, really increasing our faith in God. And then at the end result of what this is all about, to further put our trust in him, so that we will take advantage of the plan that he has given for us to be redeemed, to live eternally with him.
I don't know if this means anything, but
yeah, go ahead.
In 46 verse 1 it says, "And Israel took his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba." Now, that means Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all stopped at Beersheba.
Yes.
And, in Genesis 21, 31 to 33, we can read about Abraham. And then in chapter 26, 23 with Isaac. And then here in 28 verse 10 and here we read about Jacob. And so that's kind of interesting. I don't know what significance it might have, but for some reason they stopped there.
Right. I believe it shows the consistency, John, of the promise that God has made and to them, and you could see this connection. Beersheba has this connection, so you see this consistency that goes on with that, and further fulfilling the promises. The promise that God made to them. And another thing, too, in the vision aspect, I want to mention, over in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 1, where the writer points out that God spoke long ago to the fathers. And this is one of the ways, and he mentions in various ways. And so here is one of the ways that God had revealed his will and encouragement to his people. And it mentions this specifically here in verse 2, which associates back to or over to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1. So we can take confidence in that what we are reading in the New Testament has reference to God's promise being fulfilled, especially later on in the Christ. That's the context of Hebrews chapter 1.
That's a good point.
So it begins just a beautiful picture and causes us to have faith in the Lord. So again, as it brings us down to the latter part of chapter 46, there, and you pointed out, John, that they had the land of Goshen. That was given to them. That's where they dwell. And I can understand Pharaoh being favorable for this. Because remember Joseph's blessings to, remember Potiphar's house while Joseph was there, and even in the prison, the blessings there. And now Pharaoh, the whole land is blessed because of him. Hey, and if your family is like you, have them all come down.
Well, it's like you said a moment ago. Pharaoh was wise enough to see that the God that he serves is stronger than any gods there.
Absolutely.
And when he was able to interpret that dream, and then that started coming true.
Absolutely.
And God, of course, with he was a man too after God's own heart. Joseph was. God was with him. God, instructed him, communicated with him as to what to do, and this even brought more favor. But these are all good points, like you said. All these things that were happening to show that Joseph, his God is greater than any gods down in Egypt.
Absolutely, and again, and later on in the history of Israel, even in the captivity that took place during the days of Daniel, remember they are in the land of Babylon, and they have an impact on the rulers there as well. And so that brings us back to that point about the glorification of God in tough situations, and we need to look at that. And I know there's a lot of folks who don't believe in God. They don't see this, but we who believe in Him and have seen Him, and I know these things they're easier said than done. Yeah. Because when you're caught up in it, it's tough. It's tough treading, and keeping that focus there, man, it's tough. But as you said, when we look back on it, just as Joseph did, we can see God's hand.
One of the things I see here just come in my mind. Okay. Now we talk about Joseph, and Pharaoh sees, Joseph's God, how strong he is and what he can do. But yet, when Moses comes down to lead him out, what happened? Because when we read later on, there rose up a Pharaoh that knew not.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Then all of a sudden, God sends Moses, tell him to let my people go. No. So each one of those plagues, when we study the Bible, each one of those plagues, what God really does is show His superior power and authority. Because, the first couple plagues, the magicians could kind of, hoodwink and make it look like they were doing something. But after that, the Egyptians also forgot. Right. Because they knew when this Pharaoh was in command, they knew the power of God, but they forgot, and, under that Pharaoh, God reminded them, so to speak, and made their gods look foolish.
Absolutely. And as you get into chapter 47, which we're quickly running out of time, just to kind of start whetting the appetite for the discussion, I want you to notice, and I encourage you to read ahead and read chapter 47. I want you to notice some interesting scenarios in that chapter. Number one, Jacob and Pharaoh. In this aspect, and then and notice then the Joseph and Jacob, and so those are the dynamics that I would encourage us to look at in chapter 47, and actually through the end of the book of Genesis here, which shows that again, I think it relates back to the power and the ways of God. Are vastly superior, and we just need to trust them.
Yeah, just quickly, because we're running out of time there. But one of the things I had thought about, when he was talking about Joseph and how he was blessed in everything he did. You know, he was down there and got sent to prison and all that stuff. But it doesn't stop there, because in verse 47, we're going to find that Joseph was so impressed with him and evidently his family that the Pharaoh says, "Here, take all my cattle and you take care of them."
Right, yeah. Exactly.
So what do you think's going to happen?
Absolutely.
Well, tune in next week to find out.
Yes, my friends, we are out of time. And so we invite you to join us again next Thursday at 7 p.m. as we spend a moment with the Master, as we study God's Word and as we grow in the grace and knowledge of His will. But in the meantime, my friends, may God bless you as you continue to study and apply His will in your life.